Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history down this lane of memories.
Down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Is India's 20.9 lakh crore stimulus package an impressive response to the challenge that the country faces economically, or is it somewhat inadequate? That's the key issue I should raise today with the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India and former chief economic advisor, Raghuram Rajan. Dr. Rajan, you now know the details of that 29 lakh crore package that the government has announced. So let me put that question to you. Do you see it as an impressive response to the economic challenge the country faces, or is it somewhat inadequate?
Well, we are facing probably the greatest economic emergency we've seen in our lifetime across the world. So almost any response is inadequate. I think it's particularly so in India's case because we've had years of economic drift in which our growth has slowed, our fiscal deficits have gone up. There's a lot more we need to do in order to set the economy back on track. And in the face of this emergency, basically we have to pull out all stops. And in that light, this package has some good points, but it probably needs to do more.
I want to pick up on that point that you made, that we need to pull out all stops. 14 separate institutions have calculated that this 20.9 lakh crore package actually only consists of just about 2 lakh crore, which is roughly 1.1% of GDP as a fiscal stimulus. The rest is loans, credit guarantees, and funding schemes. I presume fear of an uncontrolled fiscal deficit restrained the government, but in your eyes, was this wise caution or was it a mistake?
Well, let's look at what needs to be done and then look at it in that light. First, we got to stop the spread of the virus. And unfortunately, that battle is still going on. The second is we got to find ways to give relief to the people who are being affected, to give relief to these small firms that are affected. Third, we got to repair the places in the economy that need repair. This includes some of the big firms, this includes the banks, and of course, this includes the MSMEs. Fourth, we need to provide for the recovery. That means some kind of stimulus so as to get the recovery going. And finally, we need reform. Now, where does the package sort of fail in providing resources primarily? That's on the recovery, the stimulus. And hopefully, down the line, as we finish the fight against the virus, there is some attempt to create stimulus. But on all the other measures also, the question is, have we done enough? Let me leave the issue of repelling the virus to the experts, to the pandemic experts. I'm not one. But on relief, could we do more for the people, for more in terms of food, more in terms of money, especially for the migrants who have been left adrift, but also for ordinary people who have been under lockdown for 2.5 months. Food grain is not enough. You need other things to cook, other things to ensure shelter. Money would be good. A lot more needs to be done. So that's one example of where we could do more.
Can I take you through all those different things one by one? But before I do that, I get the feeling you're saying that given the challenge, given the number of things she needed to do, she should have been prepared to let, in this instance, the fiscal deficit grow. Containing it or trying to keep it within the target of 3.5% was a mistake. This is one instance where she should have spent more. Otherwise, she cannot tackle those 4 or 5 critical things that you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, to some extent, what we need to do is give investors, give the rating agencies more conviction that we are, one, doing what is essential to preserve and protect the economy, and that is in everybody's interest, including the investors' interest. It is nobody's interest to see an economy which is broken emerge from this crisis. That's one. And second, that we will do everything to get the economy back on the true and appropriate fiscal path once the emergency is over. So there had to be statements about how we would both come clean on the true extent of the deficit and two, get us back on the fiscal path. There are lots of suggestions around. For example, the NK Singh committee has said we should have an independent fiscal commission which can opine on the true level of the deficit as well as measures to get us back on track. Those would build some commitment in for investors that eventually we'll get back. But now, in the face of this emergency, saving the economy, saving the people is most important.
In the light of what you just said, let's then go back and visit those 4 or 5 critical target areas that you identified earlier. I'll go through them one by one so the audience can understand, and I'll start with immigrant, migrant workers, the poor and the vulnerable. The first package of relief given to them in March gave them 5 kilograms of grain, as well as 500 rupees if their wives had Jan Dhan accounts, but only for a 3-month period. This amount was considered at the time grossly inadequate. It hasn't been enhanced. The period hasn't been extended, which means in exactly 40 days from today, this relief will end. Now, what the finance minister has done is to include on Sunday those who were earlier excluded from this package. So let me begin by asking you, what do you make of this government's attempt to ameliorate the suffering of the poor? What do you make of its response to the plight of the poor?
Well, I think this is one place where it was important to both send more money as well as open food grains. Maybe there's adequate amounts, but people can't just eat food grains. They need vegetables. They need oil to cook with. They need other stuff. That means a certain amount of money along with the food grains. They also need shelter. So I think at this point, the sense is, and certainly from the migrants who have left the cities to go to their villages, where they will find more welcoming sort of relatives to look after them, I think this has been inadequate. Of course, there have been attempts to remedy the initial sort of announcements to ensure that local governments come in and help, voluntary agencies are helping, but certainly more could have been done.
Now, in an article that you wrote with Amartya Sen and Abhijit Banerjee for the Indian Express on the 15th of April, you suggested that the government should be prepared to give temporary ration cards to anyone who was willing to stand in a queue. And secondly, you said they should put 5,000 rupees in every Jan Dhan account. And you ended that article with the following sentence: skimping on helping the truly needy is the surest way to lose the plot. The government has not heeded your advice about cash payments. So are they now today in danger of losing the plot?
Well, I feel for the people who have suffered through this whole, who have suffered through the lockdown. It also means that when you sort of lift the lockdown, a lot more people will leave home because there's really no money at home. They have to go out and look for a living. And of course, the migrant issue, on the one hand, it is really painful to see the migrants walking back to their homes, carrying children with them. But also, it is not, conducive to tackling the pandemic because they're moving from crowded cities where the pandemic is rife to villages where they may be carrying the virus with them. So really, this is neither in the nation's interest and, of course, is not appropriate humanitarianly. I understand we're trying to do the best we can, but we could do more.
You know, she was questioned on Sunday when she held her last press conference to declare the last tranche. She was questioned why she had not accepted the advice given by you, Amartya Sen and Abhijit Banerjee, to make immediate cash payments. And her reply was, there are many ways to address the problem. What we did will have greater impact. Then on Wednesday evening, literally half an hour before this recording, she said to ANI that loans will have a greater multiplier effect than direct cash transfers. Do you accept that?
What would have a greater impact? I'm sorry.
Loans will have a greater multiplier effect than direct cash transfers.
Well, I think laws take time to work. I think what is immediately the problem is hungry people. I mean, there is a report that half of the families, and of course, I don't know the details of the survey to see how accurate it is, but half of the families have skipped meals at this time. This is not a good situation for a country that prides itself on being a strong emerging economy. We can certainly find the money. It's not that much compared to the 20 lakh sort of proposal, 20 lakh crore proposal that was put on the table. It is not that much, and we should find it for the most needy.
Let's come to the second of the targets you listed at the beginning of this interview that need to be tackled, the MSMEs, which represent something like 30% of the economy, 45% of manufacturing, I'm told 50% of export, but perhaps most importantly, they employ up to 12 crore people. Now, the finance minister has given them collateral-free loans and credit guarantees amounting to 3.7 lakh crore. Do you see this sector bouncing back to life, or is there more that she needed to do?
Well, I think this is a sector which has been targeted by the government for a number of years with the Mudra scheme. A lot of money has gone into this sector. Borrowing has gone up, and not all of it has been good. If you look at the public sector banks, even in 2018, the NPAs on the MSME loans were 15%. The private sector banks were doing a lot better. And this is almost always a consequence of the government giving diktats on lending. You make bad loans. The problem here is that this sector has been distressed time and again by policies which limit its business capabilities. Demonetization was one. They haven't been able to adapt adequately to the goods and services tax. And the slowing growth over the last few years has hit them once again. So this is a sector in deep distress, but also heavily indebted. Now, how do you resolve this? I mean, giving them more debt at this point, you have to be very careful. You have to be very careful that you don't add to the debt problem. And you also have to be very careful that the banks, when they lend more to these entities, don't use it as a way to funnel out the money back to themselves to bail out the bad loans they've given in the past. Now, I looked at some of the early announcements of this scheme. I need more detail. But I don't know what there is right now which prevents the banks from using this to essentially bail themselves out rather than helping the MSMEs. What we really need for the MSMEs is an improvement in their business conditions, which means stronger growth as we come out of this recession, but also looking at their debt situation and finding ways to give them debt relief rather than additional debt, restructure the debt they already have, but also, and this is the last point, the scheme, essentially the 3 lakh loan scheme, gives more loans to those who already have loans. What about the MSMEs who have no loans whatsoever, who are trying to find ways to get working capital as they get out of this pandemic, who've been closed for a couple of months, who need money? Are they going to get any lending? What is that going to be? So I think it's important to make sure the scheme works for the MSMEs rather than a way to help the banks get their money back. And it is important that we give additional funding, not just to the ones that already have a lot of debt, but also to those who need the money to grow at this point out of their situation.
What you're saying, Dr. Rajan, is perfectly clear. The MSME sector is a badly indebted sector. In the case of Mudra loans, they're probably not able to pay them. There was a widespread belief before the coronavirus happened that those Mudra loans would turn sour. Giving them more debt is not a solution to their problems. It could only increase their indebtedness. In an interview that your colleague Abhijit Banerjee gave me on the 3rd of May, he said that the way to help MSMEs is for the government to make every effort it can to revive demand by spending liberally. That is the way, rather than try and target MSMEs directly with some sort of package. Would you agree with that broad statement?
Well, I would say there are a variety of ways they need to be helped. For example, a lot of public sector firms have, payments that they owe MSMEs. Make them today. In fact, make them yesterday. A lot of private firms that are large, that have access to capital markets, could make payments to their MSME suppliers. So these things could be done fairly quickly. Growth will help. Stronger growth will help the MSMEs. And of course, the whole idea of making business easier that the government has emphasized over so many years, if that could actually be made realistic for the MSMEs, that would help them tremendously. So I think there are a variety of things that can be done, primarily growth, but also debt relief, also repayments of monies that they owed. Perhaps we've sort of alleviated some of that tax burden, but really we need to focus on all these rather than just still more debt.
Very quickly, for the sake of the audience, I'll add that Nitin Gadkari has said that the dues owed to MSMEs by the central government, by PSUs, the state governments, is just in excess of 5 lakh crore. That's an enormous amount that would help. But one of the problems these MSMEs face is that just as the lockdown is being relaxed and the government is trying to revitalize the economy, tens of millions of their workers have actually up sticks and gone back. And even as I talk to you, every day there are millions walking back by train or by bus or simply trudging down the road. How much of a problem would that create for the MSME sector? And can the government do anything to help?
Well, it certainly would create a problem for some because their workers have left. I think it is a bad idea to restrict the movement of the workers by saying, thou shalt not leave the city. You have to make conditions in the city better for them to want to come back. And that means first, of course, tackling the pandemic problem. But second, trying to think about what the lessons are from this episode. We have a number of migrants in the city who have no safety net whatsoever. And all this talk about, Jan Dhan Yojana, JAM, Aadhaar Mobile, with all this in place, we still have no way to identify the truly poor, the truly marginal, the unemployed, and make transfers to them in bad times. We need to do that on an expedited basis so that if we have further calamities or further recessions, we find ways so as to help the marginalized so that they don't have to leave the cities and go to their, trudging long ways to their villages. Hopefully, we will not see a pandemic of this kind again. But nevertheless, this highlights the need for a stronger safety net for workers in the cities so that they feel comfortable coming back. That is something that we have to think about perhaps sooner rather than later to attract workers back to the cities. Many of them at this point in their villages with Manrega open and with wages increased for Manrega are probably going to prefer that kind of safety for a while before coming back.
Let's come, Dr. Rajan, to the third of the points that you said the government needs to address. I'm talking now of big industry, and I suppose in particular of those aspects of it that have been grounded to a halt by the lockdown: hotels, restaurants, aviation, car manufacturers, and construction. Other than a 70,000 crore boost to an existing scheme for middle income housing being developed on a PPP basis, I didn't hear very much that would encourage big business. Was that a mistake or a lapse on the finance minister's part, or is she right in the assumption this is a sector that can take care of itself and will get back on its feet without assistance from the government?
I suspect this is a place where the resources required, if you wanted to bail out of the kind that the US is undertaking right now, would be enormous. So we have to look for alternative ways to deal with the problems. Take the airlines. I mean, many of them have reasonable amounts of debt and have gone through 2 or 3 months without any passengers. They are bleeding, and it's not likely that revenues will come back fast. So this is again a situation, if you don't have the money to bail out, which again, bailouts are costly and probably unwarranted, then you have to look for alternatives. The alternative here would be debt relief. That is, given the high debt loads, given the fact that they have been burning through cash for some time, you have to restructure the debt in these companies so that you don't close them down, but they can fight another day. And given that this crisis was not the fault of management, you keep the management in place, but restructure the debt quickly. Now, that requires a speed up in the restructuring process, instructions and enabling devices for the banks to do it. And it also requires, at the back end, a bankruptcy code which is geared up in case the restructuring fails to deal with the problem itself. Now, what we've done is a mix of things. We've suspended the bankruptcy code for a year. I don't know why we did that. It is not meant to be the first port of call, but it is meant to be there to tell people that if restructuring fails, there's an alternative. So, how do lenders actually threaten the borrower to do an appropriate restructuring and vice versa? It's not clear to me. So, I would have thought that for these large companies, that have difficult problems. The government cannot keep replenishing their coffers, but certainly debt relief would have been a viable act. I hope it is still in the works, but we need to do more to speed up that process and to make sure that they come back when they're needed.
Very quickly, Dr. Rajan, from that answer, I get the feeling that you sort of think the government hasn't thought through carefully enough, or maybe I mean clearly enough, the different ways it could help big industry. And as a result of not thinking through it carefully or clearly, it's opted to do very little, or sometimes things that are not quite as straightforward and clear as they should be.
Well, I'm hoping it hasn't communicated yet what its thinking is. But these are issues that every government is now grappling with. How much of bankruptcy? How much of support? How much of restructuring? Given the nature of this virus, especially given the fact that it's affecting our large companies also, it is extremely important we think about this quickly. And we have in place structures that allow these entities to come out with moderate amounts of debt rather than become so indebted. To some extent, we need to sort of deal with this if we are to get the economy back on track.
One last question before I take a break, and let me begin by saying this is not something the finance minister herself mentioned, but the agriculture minister has almost in so many words said that he believes agriculture has come through the lockdown without much damage. He believes that the Rabi harvest has happened very satisfactorily, procurement is almost complete, and he's then gone on to say that agricultural growth this year will be 3%, which is just marginally below last year's 3.7%. Do you get the feeling he's being over-optimistic, or do you think he might well be right?
He may well be right, because it's agriculture is a sector, certainly relies a lot on labor, but it's not clear to me that that labor has disappeared at harvest time. Perhaps in places like Punjab, which use a lot of migrant labor, but maybe the farmers have made do, and maybe he is right that this is a sector which has survived the downturn. Now, the big issue now is really going forward. There have been a number of reforms that have been announced in the agricultural sector by the government, reforms that have been talked about for a long time. And it is extremely important we implement them, because the agricultural sector is one that has seen steadying or growing stress over time. And if we implement these reforms, there's some hope for that sector.
I want very much to talk about 4 or 5 of the top reforms the government has announced during this crisis, and ask you whether they're substantive and meaningful or whether they're just red herrings. But I'll do that after the commercial break. Let me end this part by saying you've indicated 3 areas where you have concerns about the government's response: for the poor, the migrant, and the vulnerable, for MSMEs, and for big industry. If all that has been announced up to Sunday is all that happens, what do you think will be the shape and look of the Indian economy 1 year from now?
Will be heavily constrained. It will be, perhaps a shadow of its former self. Now, there will be room for expansion as some of the entities today essentially sort of die. But that expansion will take time. It will typically be the larger firms which gain market share, and it will be at the expense of the smaller entities that don't get help. Now, we've talked a lot about areas that need work. One area we haven't talked about is the financial sector. That too needs work. And that needed work before the coronavirus crisis. After the crisis, it will need significantly more work.
You are, in fact, an expert on the financial sector in particular. Quickly, then, make up and remedy my lapse by telling us what you think the government should do about the financial sector.
Well, we've got so many moratoria. We've postponed payments, this, that. A lot of this will turn into NPAs. We already talked about the MSME NPAs. There is a lot of bad debt around, and a lot of that bad debt is owed to the banking system. Typically, the private banks this time around have been better at managing risk than the public sector banks. So there will be a lot of bad debt showing up at the doors of the public sector banks. And that means that, one, you have to bring it down through a process of restructuring, etc. Two, you have to recapitalize the public sector banks to a significant extent. But three, you have to stop the hole in the leaky bucket. You have to focus on governance improvements in the public sector banks. Let me give you one example. In the MSME lending, the RBI pointed out in 2018 that the bad public sector banks, the banks that were put under restriction by the RBI, prompt corrective action, the only place they could lend was to the MSMEs because they couldn't make big loans. That was one of the constraints that was imposed by the RBI. They still found ways to make losses. In the first year of the MSME loans that they made, 4% of the loans turned into NPAs. That suggests the poor quality of management that we have. We absolutely have to stop the leaky bucket.
Dr. Rajan, let's take a break at that point. As I said, when I come back, I want to talk to you briefly about the reforms, structural reforms in particular, that the government has announced, and ask you whether these are meaningful and substantive, or whether they amount to red herring. But first, a message from our sponsor, Glenlivet.
Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, yeah, 'cause little did we know the good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire. My guest is the former Governor of the Reserve Bank of India and former Chief Economic Advisor, Raghuram Rajan. Dr. Rajan, let's now come to the structural reforms the government has announced during this crisis. And as you mentioned yourself in part one, perhaps the most significant are three to do with agriculture: amending the Essential Commodities Act and agricultural marketing, and facilitating contact farming. The government has said that they believe that these three reforms are the agricultural equivalent of ending the license permit Raj. Would you accept that these are as significant as that?
I would. I think these are important reforms, but it's important that they be carried out to the full extent of the intent. And unfortunately, sometimes in carrying out reforms, they get hijacked by the bureaucracy. The Essential Commodities Act, for example, prevents commodities from being stored in a big way. And that forces the farmer sometimes to sell out in a hurry and get low prices simply because nobody wants to store those commodities. So this will be very important for the farmer. The problem, however, is there are always clauses buried in these in any reform, which then subverts the whole reform. The sting of the scorpion, as one bureaucrat told me, everything is negotiated, and then finally there's one clause which subverts. In the Essential Commodities Act, it will be, what are the circumstances in which the Essential Commodities Act can be brought back for a commodity? And typically that means certain price rises. Well, if that becomes too easy, if onions move around all the time, if we can invoke the Essential Commodities Act again when the price moves by a certain amount, we've subverted the intent of what is of the reform. So it has to be much harder to bring it back. There have to be exceptional circumstances, a pandemic or something like that. Otherwise, we should let market forces do what they do and allow imports to happen or exports to happen, as the case may be, rather than intervening to manage those prices.
Now, Dr. Rajan, a second significant reform is the decision to open up all sectors of the economy to the private sector, whilst restricting the public sector to a still undefined strategic area. And associated with this is a significant amount of privatization. I assume none of this is going to make any impact until the economy is back on its feet. But how important a message does this send for the medium and long term?
Again, I think this is an important step. I think it is important that we execute. I think Ashok Gulati, who has been associated with the government on various committees, said 50% of the announcements on agriculture had actually been carried through. And that's a low hit rate. We need to execute what we announce and quickly. We've talked privatization for so long. Every budget has a huge privatization number. And eventually, we achieve some fraction of it, and often largely by selling one public sector to another public sector. That's not privatization. And I hope this announcement indicates a willingness to have essentially mixed sectors, not dominated by the public sector, but having some public sector presence in some areas. I think that's fully appropriate for the country. We don't need to privatize everything, but we certainly need to start getting government out of a number of entities that it owns.
Now, the third set of major reforms that seem to be on the anvil are huge, if not dramatic, relaxations of labor reforms undertaken by 3 BJP-ruled states, UP, Madhya Pradesh, and Gujarat. And they cover a whole range of things from hours of work, sanitary and health regulation, hire and fire, and union rights. Do you see this as something that will spur investment, or do you see it as a rather disturbing disregard for well-established union rights?
Well, I think that it is important to negotiate the process of labor reform with all parties, including labor. I think what we need to do is realize the constraints that the old laws impose, both on business as well as on labor, and understand there is a win-win alternative for both, where you protect workers better in some situations, especially the contract workers. Give them severance pay for the years of service they've done, improve their working conditions, but allow for some flexibility. If the firm actually is going under because it has too many workers, it should be able to lay off a number of workers, paying appropriate severance, while keeping the rest in a job rather than taking everybody down. So this kind of negotiation is very important. I understand there's an Industrial Relations Act in Parliament. And maybe it doesn't go as far as some industrialists want. Maybe it goes further than some labor want. But we need to negotiate this process. The worry is if you just, in a stroke of the pen, do away with labor protections, then what is the worker going to do? If the worker is totally unprotected by the laws, they're going to take to the streets to protect themselves. That is in no one's interest either, where you have strikes, violence, geraos, in an attempt to reestablish worker rights. So my sense is this is something that needs to be done in a deliberate way. We should do it as fast as we can, but we should take all parties with us. Finally, as I understand it, these labor law dispensations are for 3 years. Who's going to invest knowing that at the end of 3 years, it may all change again? This leads to a larger point. What business wants is certainty. We keep talking, we want FDI, and we keep changing the rules all the time on FDI. Sometimes for good reason, sometimes to favor parties who complain about the foreign investors. nobody really wants to invest in a big way if they don't have certainty, because they're putting in money for 10, 15 years. And if they can't even believe that the laws will stay what they are for the next year or two, they have really more moderate incentives to invest. So my sense is we need to clarify what this will look like for time to come rather than keep changing it. And certainly 3-year limits are not particularly encouraging for investors.
Now, on Sunday, the finance minister identified three sectors which she believed would be growth sectors in the future. These are coal and mineral mining and defense production. And there's no doubt that in all three, she's taken substantive measures to open them up. But you know better than me that mining, both coal and mineral, is an area where the states have rights in terms of licenses, in terms of granting permission. Is there a danger here that in using coal and mining as growth and laying down central laws to determine its future, she's trespassing on center-state relations and perhaps sending out a message of centralization and diminishing federalism?
Well, look, I think the center has to be very careful of intruding on the states as well as the federalism that has been enshrined in the Constitution. That doesn't mean it can't play an enabling role. It can't, create model laws. It can't nudge states towards those. But also through creating interstate competition, it can encourage recalcitrant states, reluctant states, to actually up their game and join in, especially for things like mining. I mean, investors are going to look to which is the state that is most welcoming and go there. So I think the center can play an enabling role. But I think the issue you raise more broadly of center-state relationships, I think it is something that is extremely important. I think in a country of our size, decentralization typically is a constant necessity. It's something that every finance commission has recognized. And we need to continue on this path going forward rather than go towards more centralization. Center creates the framework, creates the enabling infrastructure, gives the nudges, but the states essentially on many of these things decide.
In fact, Dr. Rajan, I'm holding up your new book. Here it is in my hands. The audience can see it. It's called The Third Pillar. And this issue that we're discussing of centralization and diminishing federalism is one of your key concerns. One of the things that everyone knows is that the fight against the virus, as much as the recovery from the lockdown, is something where the states will be in the front line. And yet the center refused initially to give them an increase on their borrowing limits. And eventually, when it did so on Sunday, it's attached 4 conditions. Do you believe that this is the wrong way of ensuring things like portability of rations or better handling of power distribution companies, that attaching the two together and making conditions only increases centralization, diminishes federalism, and puts the backs up of states?
Yeah, no, I think it is reasonable for the center to worry about runaway deficits in states, which is why those limits on states have been imposed. But to micromanage the state approach to a particular activity presumes that the center knows better. And to some extent, in the constitutionally, we believe the states on some issues are the prime mover, and their freedom to act should not be constrained by the center. So I think the center has a legitimate interest in seeing that there isn't overborrowing, but how that is spent, to my mind, is something which is primarily the decision of the states. And apart from nudges, I think micromanaging that is something that limits the states and infringes on their rights in some sense.
My last question, Dr. Rajan, you've been chief economic advisor. After that, you were governor of the RBI. You know and understand not just the Indian economy, but also the sort of political constraints that hold up politicians taking reforms. You've seen it from the inside. On the principle that one should never waste a crisis, are there measures that you believe Indian politicians should implement for the good of the economy, but perhaps weren't able to do so for understandable political reasons. Now, this crisis gives them a chance to do it. Are there such measures in your mind?
Well, there are. I think easing the factor markets, labor, land, in a negotiated way, labor, land, and finance would be very important. Easing doing business would be very important. But I think that the government has its hands full, even dealing with this crisis. So I would be perfectly happy if we manage this crisis well. And we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things we didn't talk about is that apart from the repel the virus, offer relief, repair the economy, we haven't talked about recovery. And this is where we will need some amount of stimulus to get the economy back on the road. And we need to start planning that. What kind of stimulus will be most appropriate? Are we going to have more infrastructure built out? If so, how do we make that possible so that right from day one, when the economy starts opening up, we can build more roads, build more ports? That is something which is no-brainer in India. It is a way to re-energize the economy. How do we get the construction sector up and running? How do we get the builders who have deep problems back on track? These are things we should be thinking about now. Even if we manage this crisis well, I think it will be par for the course. We should be thinking about reforms, and I think India is overdue for a new set of reforms. Some of what has been announced will help. We need far more. But I also think we need to deal with this crisis. This is, in a sense, a nation-threatening crisis. We need to tackle it now.
You're leaving us on a tantalizing note that we need to do more to ensure recovery, particularly in terms, as you pointed out, of the construction sector and infrastructure. Is this simply a question of more money directed at them in some sort of bailout manner? Or is it also specific schemes that need to be set up and carefully thought through?
We have a lot of black holes. We can't pour more money down those black holes. We've poured enough. We need to first, as stopper the holes, we need to be clever about where we put money. We need to be clever about the form in which we put money. And often these entities that we need to put money in are already heavily indebted. We need to find ways to restructure that debt. A lot needs to be done. But if we do that, we can get the economy back on track. And remember, we're not just repairing the problems of the coronavirus. We're repairing 3 or 4 years of drift in which we have gotten into a bad situation even before the virus. We need to do all that it takes to set the economy back on track. This requires the entire focus of the government, not.
There's a paradox in what you said, and I want to point it out before I end, that we're not just repairing the damage of the coronavirus, we're repairing the 3 to 4 years of drift. The problem is that drift happened under this government, and yet the repairing of the drift has to be done by the government. Do you believe they're capable of correcting the drift they allowed to happen? Because they don't even begin to believe they've allowed the economy to drift. They don't even accept that.
Well, they need to accept data. They need to first make sure the data are truly presented as they are, rather than data it doesn't reflect reality. We need to get the data out. We need to understand where we truly are, and we need to do what it takes to set this economy back on track. That requires enormous work. There are lots of capable people in India. They need to be brought in to help the government. It can't all be done by the Prime Minister's office. It needs to bring a greater group of people. There are perfectly capable finance ministers, even from the BJP, who would be happy to provide their advice. Bring more people in, understand the problems, set more people to work on them, and perhaps we will come through this crisis a lot stronger.
You're saying in code, get the advice of people like P. Chidambaram, Yashwant Sinha. Get the advice of people, even if they're your political opponents, because they are capable. It can't all be done by the PMO.
This is a national emergency. You don't start looking at who's on the other side of the political aisle. We're all in it together. And therefore, get their opinions. They are smart, sensible people who've been through something like this before.
In which case, and this is definitely my last question, do you have a sense of confidence that this government can actually take the steps needed for recovery? There is so much that they need to do to first correct their attitude. Correct is the euphemism. Alter and completely change their attitude. Will they do it? Politicians often in a crisis become stubborn. Sometimes they become innovative, but sometimes they become stubborn. Do you have any hint or feeling that this is a government prepared to do almost a U-turn to help enable recovery?
I don't know. I hope the leadership sees that this is necessary. I also believe that if we don't do what is necessary going forward, circumstances will force us to do it, because it can get very ugly very quickly, given the forces that we're up against.
When you say it would get very ugly very quickly, you're suggesting that you're very, very worried about the future of the country.
I am very worried about the extent of the catastrophe we are facing. And this requires all hands on deck. We need to be working very hard to get out of this. And it is important we recognize the magnitude of the problem sooner rather than later.
Dr. Rajan, thank you very much for this interview, and thank you for making time in such a full measure to explain and educate. Take care, stay safe.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.